Okay, this is lecture 7, Armitage and Braddick, chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10 is Elizabeth Mancke's Empire and State, and we will pick up there. Okay, sorry. Right. Okay, so this Atlantic world is defined by states, right? So we have the states of Spain and Portugal, England. These states, which in this period are just beginning to coalesce into a state entity. These states are the ones that are in charge of heading about this Atlantic world. But the states are government at home, and the empire is government abroad. So this is the concept of where these overseas colonies are defined by the states, according to Mancke, but they're colonized by empires, which sets up a sort of two-track process. Two tracks that are operating in parallel as opposed to interdependent. So at the state, this is development of the nation state, which as it's occurring in the home colony or the home land, the mother country, this is about the state solidifying its control over its citizens and the countryside. So on one avenue here, you have the state that's really beginning to take firmer control over the territory that it rules and installing legal structures, all sorts of things that are, enforcing the writ of the government. That's state business. At the same time, they're expanding and creating empires, colonial empires overseas, but these empires are very loose. There's very little control over these empires. As we saw in the British Atlantic world, many of these first colonies got permission from the crown, but they were independent entities. So they're operating without much direct oversight and control in the British Atlantic world. I should note that this is different than the Spanish system. The Spanish system was very hierarchical, not just the church, which we talked previously about the mission system, but the governing system was very hierarchical, and decisions had to be made back in the mother country that extended through the ruling system in the colonies to a much greater extent than is true in the British Atlantic world. So these two tracks of development, they leave open the question of exactly what are the colonies? Are they part of the internal affairs of the state, or are they external affairs of the government in terms of colonies? External affairs are how you deal with foreign states. Internal affairs are how you deal with the written rule of law within your own territory. So as this British Atlantic world colony develops, it's not clear what the status is of the colonies. It's a process that evolves over time, we shall see. So the first people who are in this colonial Atlantic world are the Portuguese and the Spaniards. And they're coming into some measure of conflict. And so they're bumping into one another in terms of claims in the empire. And this is a problem. So they figure out a way to resolve this conflict. They drew upon a previous model in that since both were Catholic states, they laid their appeal before the Pope, who crafted a compromise that drew a line that said, from here east, this is Portuguese territory, which would include the subcontinent or the continent of Africa. And then from here west is Spanish territory. So this line on the map was by papal decree, and both the Portuguese and the Spaniards agreed to it. Where they drew the line is why Brazil speaks Portuguese, because as it turns out, a big chunk of the South American continent known as Brazil was on the eastern side of that line, the Portuguese side. So that validated Portuguese claims to colonies there. But this solved, or at least put these problems officially solved between the Spanish and the Portuguese. But as you can imagine, it's not a solution that's readily embraced by the French or who are also a Catholic state but are left out of negotiations, and the British and the Dutch, who are not Catholic states and who have thrown off the authority of the Pope. So this line of amity that's drawn on the map is something that the British, French, and Dutch aren't too keen to follow. But in the early colonial period, the powers in the Atlantic world are in the New World, the Spaniards, and in the Indian Ocean, African world coasts, it is the Portuguese. So even though you may not really agree with it, none of the states were powerful enough to really challenge it, especially not the British. The British were comparatively weak. And so they employed the tactics of the weak, as we shall see. So what the British, French, and Dutch pushed for was a different way of understanding colonial possession, not by papal decree, but by the criteria of discovery. Who finds it first lays claim, hence the idea of planting your flag. Second, occupation, who puts people there to control the territory or to subjugate the territory. And third, conquest, who comes along and shoves off the first set of people and claims it for their own. So the British, French, and the Dutch asserted this much more than in lieu of the papal decree, let's say. This relationship of the strong Spanish world in the Atlantic colonies in the New World is one that changes over time. So initially, the Spanish are able to maintain control over this. Some recent example or some examples we cited previously. That's why the French went up to Canada, because their colony that they established on Paris Island was burned to the ground by the Spaniards. And that's why the English hid their colony up the James River at Jamestown. The idea of trying to avoid Spanish punishment for trying to infringe on this territory. So the colonies established by the British are ones that they have very loose control over. The colonies, as we saw in the case of the Virginia colony, Jamestown is founded by adventurers who are looking to get rich. The Puritans established their colony in New England, and they have their own charter. A charter they refused to give back to the crown when they wanted it. So this colonial system, these small outposts of colonial British control, they grow and evolve pretty much autonomously. There's very little control from the central government, the British government, partly because they're so weak, partly because they're busy at home, as we shall see in the latter stages of this lecture. So this process of colonial development, in the absence of overruling authority, they evolve their own methods within a very loose framework. When the British began to seek to strengthen their control, one of the first things they had to do was generate more revenue and build up their navy. So that's what we see with the 1651 Navigation Acts, or the Navigation Acts that center around 1651. That is an attempt by the British government to get a firmer control in the colonies, because they did not want the colonies trading with the Dutch. That's enhancing another state at the expense of the mother country. So when they sought to begin to crack down and control this trade for the benefit of the mother country, you see it through the Navigation Acts. But there's some problems that change over time that the British state has in maintaining its control over the colonies. First, their position at the outset is very weak. The British state is not a very strong state, not strong in international affairs. They cannot compete with the Spanish. So they are reduced to the tactics of those who are weak, which is piracy. So the British issued letters of marque, which give quasi-official status to privateers to raid Spanish shipping. So these pirates are, you can condemn them as lawless, but many of them were at least tacitly approved by the crown and their activities. And oftentimes they gave the crown a little bit of a cut. So that's what turns a pirate into someone like Sir Francis Drake, right? So this process, from their weak position, they can't directly confront the Spanish in the colonial world, so they go with ways that they can deny, right? They're pirates, they're not acting at the behest of the state. Second, as the crown began to absorb these colonies, the crown prerogatives began to be put into place. But again, they're not very strong. And for an example, we can think about Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion occurred because the local representatives of the crown were running the system or rigging the system to benefit themselves. They were still giving the crown their cut, but they were setting up this system so that the rest of the colonists were disadvantaged while they excluded themselves from levels of taxation. And they had deals with the Native Americans that benefit themselves. So in the absence of direct control, local authorities take on local governing tactics. And in the case of the Virginia colonies, they were rigging the system to benefit themselves, even though they were officially crown representatives. When the crown absorbs control of these overseas colonies, they still don't have a lot of direct control over them. But as the British state becomes more secure and the British ability to project their power becomes more potent, they will seek to control more of the colonies. So the third thing is this challenges that the British face is trying to change the colonies from what had previously been foreign affairs. The colonies were not part of the governing business of the state governments. They were an issue for the Foreign Affairs Department or component of the government, right? So as the British seek firmer control over the colonies, they're trying to bring them in as an internal issue rather than as a measure of foreign affairs, which is how one negotiates with another state, right? When the British sought to tighten their control over their colonies, they were surprised at the pushback they got. These other colonies and their governments lobbied to maintain this hands-off or loose rein relationship. They resented this attempt to bring them to heel, as it were. The British were successful in bringing the Sugar Islands, what's known as the West Indias. The West Indias men are the people who owned the plantations and ran the governments. They are successful in bringing them to heel because the British had to. Sugar was such an enormously lucrative product that they had to control it. And so that those Sugar Islands became the protection they received because of the lucrative products they produced by the British Navy came with it a charge that you have to follow much more closely what the British state is directing you to do. So the West India men knuckled under. They weren't successful in trying to put a stranglehold on their North American colonies, specifically the colonies that become the United States. There's resistance, but the British don't push it too hard because in the early stages of this colonial enterprise, they're not producing a lot of wealth for the mother country. So if you're parceling out what your list of things to control, the North American colonies weren't high on the list at first, but that too changes over time as these colonies became more wealth generating, both for the mother country and for themselves. In the mid-18th century, the British begin to embark on an effort to put tighter control over these colonies in North America that become the United States. They're seeking to bring them under the control of domestic affairs in the same fashion that the colonies in the Caribbean were brought under control. This is partly because the United States colonies, or the colonies that in North America that become the United States, are becoming more valuable. They're producing more wealth. And how wealthy these colonies were came into very clear vision when the British troops arrived in the colonies for the 7 Years' War. This battle, which was a I won't quite say global, although there were global conflicts that are part of it, but it's a European and colonial world struggle between the British and the French Empire that played out in North America. In the British context, they call it the 7 Years' War. Here in the United States, we call it the French and Indian War. This is a conflict with the French and their Indian allies, in which the British and the American colonists bound together to defeat the French, right, and their Indian allies. The British also had some Indian allies. As the British traipsed all over the North American colonies, they saw very prosperous colonies. The effort of this conflict also increased the debt of the British Empire. And so, as from the viewpoint of the British, they spent a lot of money in this war to protect the overseas colonies, who, in the eyes of the British, felt that they stood to benefit the most. So this debt is something that's going to need to be paid down. And as the British are looking at the North American colonies, they say, these guys can probably withstand a little tax, right? And so this is, as we'll see in a later lecture, this lays at part of the root of the conflict between the United States and the British that becomes known as the American Revolution. But it's also a function of state governance. The British saw their overseas colonies as things that were part of just another district in the state, and therefore not do any sort of special benefits. The American colonists don't see it that way, as we shall see. So, which brings us to our next chapter, which is chapter 11, Elijah Gould's Revolution and Counter-Revolution. And this is examining this idea of revolution in the British context. And the British, this modern British Empire is created out of 3 different revolutions that played a part in shaping this relationship between the British and their colonies. In 1641, the English Revolution led to the conquest of Ireland, bringing the then independent Irish leadership and territory more firmly under control of England. It also led to the crushing of the Scottish Rebellion, which was challenging English authority in Scotland. So this is a revolution that asserted and squashed sort of domestic dissent and firmly led to greater control by the British government. 1688, the Glorious Revolution. The outcome of this in revolution terms is that it led to a toleration of dissidents in England. So whereas before there was this sharp intolerance and persecution of groups such as the Puritans and other dissenters like Catholics, now there is toleration in England, right? So you have, they're not encouraging you to follow any other faith except the Anglican Church, but they're willing to tolerate it, right? To dampen down this conflict. That does not extend to their colonial possession in Ireland. So the Irish Catholics were restive and seeking to support the Catholic king who is deposed to install a Protestant co-leadership, William and Mary. The Irish rebellion was squashed in Ireland, and this led to the installation of a Protestant ruling authority over this colonial possession in 1688. 1776, the third revolution in this British world or British Empire, the American Revolution, is a failure of the attempt of the British to assert their control over their colonial possessions in North America in the same fashion they had succeeded in installing their authority over Ireland and Scotland. So this American Revolution, it's part of this revolution, and it's again within the system, and it's an attempt to usurp this effort to install British control over this territory. Gould argues that over time, the dynamics of revolution in this British world pushed conflict out to the periphery. So 1641, the English Civil War, is just that, a civil war between different types of visions of ruling authority. 1688, the resolution of this revolution in England and Wales, it's not a civil war. It doesn't lead to civil war on that home island, but it does lead to conflict in Ireland, right, which is an overseas possession, although it's just across the Irish Sea for them. The American Revolution, as we call it, the revolution with the overseas colonies, that is firmly in the periphery, and it's the attempt of the homeland to assert control over this periphery. The hinterland needs to be brought to heel for the mother country. So this dynamic of revolutions, according to Gould, is pushed out. In Europe, as he terms it, Europe, these conflicts lead to legal structure, and it leads to the assertion of parliamentary power, which is an outcome of the Glorious Revolution. So it's not royal power. There's still a king who plays a pivotal role, but this is an assertion of the parliament as taking greater control over the government. Colonial conflicts, the colonies are still wild in this 17th century in the eyes of the British. So this is a dumping ground for rebels who are cleared out, the losers in these revolutionary struggles. The leadership usually ends up with their at the end of a rope, but the run-of-the-mill revolutionaries are pitched out and shipped overseas. So that leads to the presence of Irish rebels in Australia, and it leads to the presence of Irish rebels in Georgia, right? So this is a place that's still kind of wild and lawless in the 17th century, as we saw in the last one, or in Mancke's discussion. It's eventually becomes the colonies becomes an attempt to install control over them, the same way it exists in the mother home. So you have the people in the British Isles. The Irish are subjugated. The Scottish have acquiesced to this control of the English rule. It's called the British Isles because it's the crowns of the kingdom are supposedly brought together. And then the overseas colonies are a different entity. So you have two perspectives. For the colonists, they view things from the New World as these revolutions are part of their experience as well. And so in the eyes of the colonists, they see themselves as co-equal to British citizens, and therefore equal rights are applicable to them in the colonies, that they have this ability to have some measure of control over their affairs, just like British citizens do. For the British, however, they don't view the colonists as co-equals. They see them as part of subjects of the British crown, but they have, because they are in the overseas colonies, they have a subjective role. They don't have the same rights and authorities that British citizens have in the British Isles. And so what you have is this different way of viewing things that is increasingly brought to a head because the British are seeking to assert their control. this becomes an irrevocable difference, which can only be solved by this final revolution, the American Revolution, which resolves the dispute by the American colonists deciding that if they can't be co-equal, then they don't want to be part at all. All right, that's lecture 7. Next, I'll pick up with lecture 8.